Listen, if you ever hear knocking at your door in the middle of the night, especially when it's raining and everything's silent, never open it. Doesn't matter who it is or what they say, because if you make that mistake, there's no turning back. Please, for our support, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share your thoughts about the story and its narration in the comments. Let's dive into the rest of the tale together. Rain had been falling since morning. Not the kind that floods the streets, but that annoying drizzle that slicks up the pavement and makes everything feel heavier. In Salt Lake City's Old Avenues neighborhood, full of creaky Victorian houses with sagging porches, the air was cold, damp, and thick with the smell of wet dirt. Michael, a 32-year-old dude with messy hair and a faded t-shirt, sprawled on his couch. A cold coffee sat on the table, and he was screwing around on his phone, scrolling Twitter, skimming lame posts. The TV was on, volume low, because he couldn't be bothered with the news. Michael muttered, "Everything's going to shit. What's next?" and tossed his phone onto the cushion. For days, weird rumors had been floating around town. People were whispering about black-eyed children. Some swore they'd seen them in empty alleys or near Liberty Park, with eyes pitch black and terrifying. They said these kids showed up at your door at night, begging to be let in. Michael thought it was all bullshit, saying just dumb ghost stories to scare kids. But deep down, something felt off, like he shouldn't have heard those rumors at all. Around 10 p.m., the power flickered. The old lamps in his house buzzed, and Michael grumbled, "Damn it, this shitty wiring." Right then, 3 soft knocks came from the door. Tap, tap. He figured it was the wind or a branch. But when he heard it again, something wasn't right. He shuffled to the door, peeked through the peephole. Nothing. Just the wet, dark street and yellow streetlights glinting off puddles. As he turned away, a childish voice, soaked with rain, said, "Mister, we're lost. Can we come in?" A chill shot down his spine. The voice sounded wrong, like it came from somewhere unnatural. Michael's voice shook as he said, "Who are you?" The reply came, "Just let us in." His heart pounded, but for a second, he wondered if some kids were actually lost. He cracked the door open and froze. 2 kids, a girl and a boy, maybe 10 or 12, stood there in soggy, old clothes. Their skin was pale as chalk, and their eyes, black voids. No whites, no pupils, just pure darkness. Michael slammed the door and locked it. His breath caught in his throat. The knocks kept coming, louder now. The kids said, "Let us in. We're cold." Their voices synced, like robots. The smell of wet dirt seeped through the door, and the rain seemed to get louder. His mind raced. What are these things? Why are they here this late? Part of him thought he should help, but a gut instinct screamed, "Don't opened the door. He yelled, "Go home! I'm calling the cops!" Silence. No answer, no footsteps. He checked the peephole. The street was empty. He glanced at the porch, and his heart stopped. Small, wet footprints marked the wooden boards, but they were fading, not drying, like something was wiping them away. Michael didn't sleep that night. He paced the house, TV blaring, but he kept feeling someone staring from the window. Morning came, and the drizzle hadn't let up. Michael, eyes red from no sleep and looking like hell, threw on a ratty jacket and headed to Joanne's, an old-school diner in the avenues with scratched-up wooden tables, the smell of fresh coffee and burnt toast. The bell above the door jingled, and a few folks glanced up before going back to their chatter. Michael slid into a corner booth where Joe and Tommy were parked. Joe, a 50-year-old guy with a gray mustache and a worn jacket, was stirring his coffee. Tommy, 38, with messy hair, usually cracked jokes, but today he seemed off. Michael cut to the chase and said, "These black-eyed kids, you guys heard anything?" Joe's hand froze, coffee spilling onto the table. He said, "Heard? Man, I saw them. 3 years ago, middle of winter, they showed up at my door. Said, 'We want to come in.' Their voices, like they came from a damn well." Michael leaned in and said, "What happened next?" Joe glanced around and said, "Didn't let him in. Checked the locks twice and held my shotgun all night. Next day, I found out my neighbor, an old lady named Phoebe, was dead. Heart stopped. No reason why." Tommy smirked and said, "It's all crap. Probably just kids with Halloween contacts messing around." But his hands shook a bit. Michael was still chewing on Joe's story when the diner door swung open. An older woman, Leela, stumbled in, face pale, hair a mess. She marched straight to their table and said, "Last night, they were at my door." The diner went quiet. Leela's hands trembled as she said, "It was 3 a.m., watching the news. Heard a knock. Looked through the peephole. 2 kids, clothes soaked, but their eyes black as hell." Joe asked, "What'd they say?" Leela held her breath and said, "They said, 'Ma'am, can we come in? We're lost.'" Michael's heart sank. Same exact words he'd heard. Leela went on, "I said I'd call the cops, but when I grabbed my phone, they were gone. This morning I felt someone in my house, but no one was there. Just that wet dirt smell." Tommy tried to lighten the mood and said, "Maybe it was your cat." No one laughed. Joe looked at Michael and said, "Take it seriously, man. These aren't kids. They're something else." That night, the rain picked up and Salt Lake City was drowning. Michael slumped on his couch, trying to distract himself with a dumb comedy flick. But every little sound, the wind hitting the windows, the creak of the house, even cars passing in the distance, put him on edge. Past 1 a.m., a tap, tap, tap came from the kitchen window. His heart raced, but he told himself, "Chill, probably just a branch." He crept to the window, pulled back the grimy yellow curtain. Nothing, just rain and the dim glow of streetlights. He let out a breath and turned back to the living room. Then he froze. 2 kids, the same ones from last night, stood in the middle of the room. Chalk-white skin, dripping wet clothes, pooling water on the faded brown carpet. And those black eyes, like endless pits in their faces. The girl said, cold as ice, "Why'd you open the door?" Michael's heart pounded as he said, I didn't open it." His voice cracked. The kids stepped closer, water dripping onto the floor. The boy said, "Now that we're here, you can't make us leave." The lights flickered, like the power was screwing around. The room turned freezing, Michael's breath visible in the air. He stumbled back, his foot catching the couch, nearly falling. The smell of wet dirt filled the house, screaming, "This is real." He said, terrified, What are you?" The kids just stared, unblinking. The girl said, "We just want to stay. Let us stay." Her voice echoed in his head, not the room. Michael reached for the TV remote to turn it on. But the second he grabbed it, the lights went out. Darkness swallowed the house. Only the rain and his pounding heart filled the silence. A faint breathing sound, like kids, came from a corner. Michael fumbled for his phone, hands shaking, and flicked on the flashlight. No one was there, but the carpet was soaked, like someone with muddy shoes had walked through. He checked the front door. Lock still secure. "How'd they get in?" he said. He grabbed a kitchen knife and sat on an old chair all night. Every few minutes, a tap, or whisper came from somewhere in the house. Michael strained his ears and said, "Who's there?" But only one word echoed back, "Come." Michael sat in the kitchen, knife in hand, eyes locked on the darkness. The rain was driving him nuts. A faint breathing sound, like kids, drifted from a corner. He said, panicked, "Who's there?" But when he aimed his phone's flashlight, nothing. The boy's voice whispered in his head, "You invited us." Michael's voice shook as he said, "I didn't open the door." A scratching sound, like nails on wood, came from the front door. He swung the flashlight over. A small, wet footprint sat right by the door. Michael muttered, "Damn it, how'd they get in?" He checked the lock again, still locked. Back in the kitchen, a small shadow darted past the corner of his eye. He spun around and said, "Who's that?" Nothing. The wet dirt smell was so strong it felt like he was lost in a rainy forest. A faint whisper came from the bedroom. "Come, come." Michael gripped the knife tighter and said, "Stop it." He crept to the bedroom, opened the door. Empty. Bed made, window shut. But the dirt smell was stronger. Back in the living room, he flicked on the TV, but it was just static. Michael grumbled, "What the hell?" A shadow moved behind him. He turned. Nothing. But in the wall mirror, two kids with black eyes and creepy smiles stood behind him. He said, horrified, "No." He spun around, but the room was empty. He checked the mirror. Empty again. He stayed up till dawn, knife in hand, eyes wide. When the sun rose, he felt a bit better, but a bad vibe lingered, like the house wasn't his anymore. Morning hit, and Michael couldn't take it. Eyes red, looking like death, he went to the police station downtown. The station was an old brick building, smelling of stale paper and burnt coffee. Sheriff Richard Hill, a 55-year-old with graying hair, sat at his desk, fiddling with his coffee mug. Michael spilled the story. The kids, the black eyes, the whispers, the wet footprints. Richard stared and said, "You saw them, huh?" Michael, shocked, said, "You too?" Richard took a deep breath and said, "Not the first time they've shown up. Every few years, Salt Lake City gets this. Black-eyed children, always asking to be let in. They go after loners or folks whose lives are a mess." Michael frowned and said, "What happens if you let them in?" Richard looked out the window and said, "They disappear. Or worse. Knew a guy in 98, in the avenues. Opened the door. Never the same after. Kept saying, 'They're in my head.'" Richard paused and said, "Just don't let them in." Michael said, "What are they? Ghosts? Demons?" Richard shrugged and said, "Who knows? But they're not human. Saw them myself near Liberty Park, 2005. Came to my car. Said, 'Can we get in?' Locked the doors and floored it. For a week, I felt someone staring through my window every night." Michael stayed at the station for hours, talking with Richard. The sheriff showed him old files of people who'd vanished or lost it. All had seen the black-eyed kids. Michael was hooked on the mystery, but couldn't let it go. That night, Michael thought maybe the kids were done with him. He slumped on the couch, a cold pizza in front of him, barely touched. At 2:43 a.m., his phone rang. Unknown number. He picked up, hesitant, and said, "Hello?" Silence. Just faint breathing. Then a childish voice said, "Let us in." Michael's heart raced as he hung up hard and said, "What the hell was that?" The phone rang again instantly. The same cold voice said, "Michael, we're cold." He froze and said, "How do they know my name?" He hung up again, but the calls kept coming. Each time he cut the line, a new voice came through. Finally, he yanked the phone cord and said, "Enough!" But as he sat down, tap, tap, tap started at the door. Soft, steady, like small fingers. Michael grabbed the kitchen knife, went to the door, and checked the peephole. Nothing, just rain and darkness. But the knocking didn't stop. He said, voice shaking, "Who's out there? Get lost!" The sound got louder, like multiple hands pounding. He turned, grabbed his phone to call the cops, but the screen was just static, like a broken TV. He said, freaked out, "How is that even possible?" Then a whisper came from behind the kitchen wall. "Michael, let us in." He gripped the knife, staring at the wall, and said, "What are you? Why won't you leave?" Every few minutes, a tap, tap, or whisper came from somewhere in the house. He thought he saw a shadow pass the living room window, but when he pulled the curtain, nothing. Just rain and that wet dirt smell, like it was coming from inside. When dawn broke, Michael was still on the couch, eyes red, staring at the ceiling. He said to himself, "I gotta do something. This can't go on." He decided to find someone who might know about these things. He remembered Joe at the diner, mentioning an old guy who'd faced the kids and survived. Michael said, maybe he can help. That morning, he hit up Joanne's. Joe was at the corner table, nursing a hot coffee. Michael sat down and said, "Joe, who's that old guy who survived the black-eyed kids?" Joe gave him a look and said, "Henry, lives in an old house in the avenues. Fair warning, he's not all there. They say he never recovered from that night." Michael said, "Don't care. I need to talk to him." Joe scribbled an address on a napkin and said, "Be careful. Henry knows stuff you might not want to hear." Michael took it, thanked him, and said, "Got nothing left to lose." That day he headed to Henry's place, down a narrow, quiet avenue street. The house was old, with a peeling wooden porch and broken flower pots out front. Michael knocked and said, "Anyone home?" After a minute, the door creaked open. Henry, a 75-year-old with tired eyes and wild white hair, stared at him and said, "What do you want?" Michael took a deep breath and said, "Heard you know about the black-eyed kids." Henry paused, then said, "Come in, but you'll regret it." The next night, Michael was a wreck. Rain pounded down, and the house reeked of wet dirt. When the tap, tap, tap came from the door, he lost it. Knife in hand, he flung the door open and yelled, "Get the hell out!" But no one was there, just rain and an empty street. Michael held his breath and said, "I'm losing it." He stepped back inside, but in the kitchen, his heart stopped. The floor was soaked, covered in small footprints, leading from the door to the middle of the room. A cold voice behind him said, "We told you, you can't make us leave now." Michael spun around. Two kids stood in the kitchen, their smiles stretched ear to ear, black eyes bottomless. He gripped the knife and said, "What are you? Why me?" The kids didn't blink. The girl said, "We just want to stay with you." The boy said, "You invited us." Michael, horrified, said, "I never." But a flashback hit. When he was 10, in the same Avenues neighborhood, he saw a weird kid at their door. Black eyes, wet clothes. Michael had opened the door, but his mom screamed, "Shut it." He stared at the kids and said, You're the same ones." Their smiles widened. The girl said, "We always come back." The house grew colder, lights flickering again. Michael backed up, tripped over a chair, and fell. The kids stepped closer. He yelled, "Get out!" But his voice didn't seem to reach them. The power cut out. Michael clutched the knife in the dark and said, "What the hell is this?" The kids' breathing echoed from everywhere. Like the house was full of them, he flicked on his phone's flashlight, sweeping it around. No one, but wet footprints covered the floor. He stayed up till dawn, phone in one hand, knife in the other. When the sun rose, the house was empty, but the wet dirt smell lingered. Michael said, I need someone who knows what these things are. He remembered Henry's words. At his house, Henry had said, "These kids come from somewhere else. Not ghosts, not demons, something worse. They need an invite, like vampires. But if you let them in, it's over." Michael had asked, "How do I get rid of them?" Henry, with a cold stare, said, "You don't. You can only resist, but they always come back." Michael went back to Henry's that day. Henry opened the door and said, "You again? Thought you'd listen and run." Michael said, "Can't run. They're in my house every night." Henry sighed and said, "Come in. I'll show you something." Henry took him to the basement, lined with shelves of dusty books and papers. He pulled out a worn notebook and said, "Wrote this in '72, after they came for me." Michael said, "What's in it?" Henry opened it and said, "Everything I learned. They're from some dark place. Don't know where, but they want something. Maybe your soul." Michael took the notebook, flipping through it. It was full of stories from townsfolk who'd seen the black-eyed kids. One from 1965 said a young woman in the avenues let them in and vanished. Another, from 1982, said a man saw them at Liberty Park and lost his mind. Michael said, "They never stop?" Henry said, "Not unless you block their way." Michael said, "How?" Henry gave him a weird look and said, "Don't know. I just resisted. But I feel them every night, in mirrors, in shadows." Michael's heart raced. He left with the notebook in his pocket, feeling like someone was following him. From that night, Michael's house wasn't the same. Doors opened and shut on their own, like someone was walking around. Small footsteps came from the ceiling, like kids running upstairs, but the house had no second floor. Every night at 3 a.m., Michael woke up, feeling someone staring from the corner. One night, in the dark, two pairs of black eyes watched him. He yelled, "Get lost!" But the eyes just stared. One morning, he found a broken glass in the kitchen. He was sure it was fine the night before. He said, "They're messing with me." Another night, a cold, wet hand brushed his arm. He spun around and said, "Who's there?" Nothing. Shadows moved in the corner of his eye, but when he looked, they vanished. He went to Joe at the diner and said, "Man, they're driving me nuts. They come every night." Joe's face paled as he said, "Told you not to let them in. Now they're in, they won't leave." Michael said, "But I didn't open the..." Joe cut him off and said, "Doesn't matter. They find a way." Back home, Michael opened Henry's notebook. One part read, "They feed on fear. The more you're scared, the stronger they get." Michael said, "I gotta stop being afraid." But when night fell, whispers came from the walls. "Michael, stay with us." He yelled, "Leave me alone!" But his voice got lost in the house. One night, he dreamed he was in a dark forest, surrounded by black-eyed kids. A voice said, "You're ours." He woke up screaming, "I can't do this!" He went to the kitchen, lit a candle, thinking light might help. But when it flickered, two kids' shadows danced on the wall. Michael said, "What the hell are you?" The shadows vanished. He decided to hit up the church near his house, hoping for answers. At the Mormon church downtown, he talked to a priest named Father John. Michael said, "Father, something's after me. Kids with black eyes." The priest gave him an odd look and said, "Those stories are old in this town. They say they come from a dark place. Pray, but be careful." Michael was falling apart. He lost his job, couldn't focus. Friends stopped calling. At the store, people seemed to look through him. One day, he checked the mirror and said, "My eyes, why do they look like that?" They were darkening, like the kids. A flashback hit. At 10 in the avenues, he saw a strange kid at their door. Black eyes, wet clothes. He'd opened the door, but his mom yelled, "Shut it!" Michael said, "Have they been after me since then?" Nights got worse. Whispers came from the walls. "Michael, stay with us." He screamed, "Leave me alone!" But his voice didn't carry. One night, he dreamed of that dark forest again, black-eyed kids circling him. He woke up and said, "I can't take it." He started writing everything in a notebook. Every night, every sound, every shadow. He said, "Maybe writing will help me find a way out." But each time he wrote, he felt the kids getting closer. One night, he opened the notebook and found pages scrawled with childish handwriting. "We're here." Michael threw it down and said, "What the hell?" He went to Tommy at the diner. Tommy, usually a joker, was serious and said, "Michael, you look like death. What's up?" Michael said, "They're in my house. I can't sleep." Tommy said, "Go somewhere else. Get out of town." Michael said, "You think they'll stop if I run?" Tommy shrugged and said, "No clue, but you gotta try something." One rainy day, Michael woke up to a soaked house. Carpet, walls, even the air. 4 kids with black eyes stood in the living room. One stepped forward and said, "You invited us. Now you're ours." Michael said, "No, But a freezing cold spread from his fingers through his body. A flashback hit. As a kid, he'd told that black-eyed kid, "Come in." Michael, horrified, said, "This is all my fault?" The kid smiled and said, "It's always your fault." He tried to run, but his feet felt glued to the floor. The house filled with small shadows, all with black eyes. A voice in his head said, "Now you're one of us." Michael screamed, "No!" But his voice faded into the dark. Before he completely broke, Michael went to the Salt Lake City Public Library, an old building with tall wooden shelves and the smell of dusty paper. He found books saying these kids were from another world and needed an invitation. A librarian named Sarah looked at him and said, "Those stories go back a century here. Be careful. They go after people with nothing left to lose." Michael said, "How do I get rid of them?" Sarah shrugged and said, "Don't know. Just know if you let them in, it's over." He spent hours flipping through books. One from 1910 told of a family in the avenues who let the kids in and vanished. Michael said, Am I gonna disappear too? Michael finally realized as a kid he'd let one of those kids in. In that childhood flashback, when he opened the door, he felt something shift inside him. Now they were back to finish the job. One rainy night, Michael sat in his house, Henry's notebook in hand. He lit a candle since the power was out. He said, "Maybe I can find a way." But then, tap, tap, tap at the door. Michael said, "Not again." He didn't open it, but the house seemed to spin around him. A loud voice in his head said, "You're ours." Michael clutched the notebook and said, "I'm nobody's." But when he looked in the mirror, his eyes were black, like bottomless pits. He stumbled back, the notebook slipping to the floor. A whisper filled the house. "Now you're with us." Michael screamed, "No!" But his voice dissolved into the dark. The house swarmed with small shadows, all with black eyes. Then, nothing. Silence. Just the rain hitting the windows. Weeks later, Joe from Joanne's went to Michael's house. The door was open, but Michael was gone. No trace, no word. Just an old notebook on the kitchen floor, filled with Michael's writing. Every sight, every feeling, every tap-tap and whisper he'd heard. Joe picked it up, read it, and went pale. He told Tommy, "We gotta show this to someone." Michael's story spread through Salt Lake City, from diner to diner, house to house. Some said he lost his mind. Others said the black-eyed kids took him. But everyone who read his notebook knew one thing: those black eyes still lurk in the avenues. You might think this is just a story, but if you hear a knock in the dead of night and see kids with black eyes at your door, don't open it. They're not here for help. They're here to take something you'll never get back. If this story freaked you out, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop in the comments what you'd do in Michael's shoes. More terrifying stories are coming.